Hello, everyone. Yesterday, I released a video about the discovery of the Tomb of the Shroud in Jerusalem in the year 2000. I was involved in that, so watch that video. I think you'll find it fascinating and interesting. In this video, I want to play for you a slideshow presented by Dr. Nicholas Allen. It was originally on Jacob Berman's channel, History Valley, and I'm presenting this with their permission to my YouTube viewers as well, because I think Dr. Allen has explained how the Turin Shroud was made. It first came to light in the early 14th century, and the only carbon 14 dates we have on it also put it at that time. Look, I'm well aware of all of the objections. I've followed shroud studies now since 1970. I guess that would be what, 50 years? I think I've read just about everything out there. And I know people put in comments, all kinds of things. Tabor doesn't know this, Tabor doesn't know that. I'm not saying I know everything, and I don't claim to be a shroud expert on a scientific level. However, Allen is, and what he presents is, I think, very convincing. So if you're interested in the Shroud of Turin, watch this slide presentation and see what you think. Be objective. And in a subsequent video, I will go over all of the arguments that people make, pro and con. I'm not fond of calling this particular relic a fake or a fraud. We don't know exactly who made it. I think we know how it was made and when it was made. But what we don't know are the motives of the person or persons who produced it. It very may well have been for devotional purposes. I've been drawn to the shroud and fond of the shroud for all of these decades that I've studied it. And it does certainly represent to us a brutally beaten and crucified human being, even though scientifically I don't think it holds up. The reason I'm even doing this is partly because there's so much out on the internet, particularly on YouTube, that's simply not true. It just doesn't hold up, and people are being fooled by it, and I don't think that's a good thing. But also, there's new archaeology on crucifixion. A lot of the things that are being said about how people were crucified and how the nails went through the wrist, not the hand, we now know that that's not the case. So people simply haven't kept up with the latest. And so I began in that previous video yesterday to talk about the Tomb of the Shroud and what we know from that. And in the future, I want to talk about what we know of Roman crucifixion as well, from an archaeological standpoint. In fact, I'm writing an extended article, maybe even a small book, with Israel Hershkovitz of Tel Aviv University, who I would say is the world's expert on Roman crucifixion from an archaeological viewpoint and what we now know and don't know about it. So stay tuned, more to come. And I hope you learn a lot from Dr. Allen's presentation. And I love his method and his style of just going for the facts. Thank you, Jacob, for making this available to my YouTube viewers as well. And I hope everyone learns a lot.
The first thing that I want to do is, in case anybody's been living under a rock, what is to explain to the audience, for anyone that doesn't know what this thing is, what is the Shroud of Turin?
Okay, marvelous. Well, as you can see on the screen here, the first slide, I have a vertical image of the shroud unfurled. And if we go in and look at it in detail, you can see that it's a piece of linen cloth with a trace element of cotton. And it's 440 centimeters long, which is over 4.5 meters. And it is exactly 110 centimeters wide, just over a meter, or a yard for our English viewers. And you'll notice that if you look very carefully, although you cannot see these images close up, and that's a very important point, which I will come back to later, you have to stand at least 2 meters away from the shroud to see these very faint images of a man. It's a frontal image and a dorsal image. and they seem to be connected more or less at the head. Okay, now, also very visible on the cloth are these what are called train tracks, these two long, very ugly brown marks, and they were caused by a fire in the Sainte-Chapelle in Chambéry in the middle or the early 16th century, where it was once housed. And just as a little background, the cloth used to be folded up, similar to what I'm showing you here, and it was placed inside a silver casket. We don't have the silver casket anymore because it's melted. This is just an imaginary silver casket. So you can imagine what would happen. The cloth is inside the silver casket, and then as the chapelle burnt down, or a major fire inside, the temperature rose to such a height that it melted the silver. And the silver dropped onto the corner of the cloth inside the box and started a fire. Now, just to remind viewers, I'm sure most of you understand the principle that if you fold up a piece of paper and you cut a pattern out of it, and then you unfold the piece of paper, you get a repeat pattern. I mean, as children, we all made these things as children, and that's exactly what happened to the shroud. So if I raise the shroud up here now and I simplify it, and I'm showing you very exaggeratedly the holes that were made by the fire, and you can clearly see how it was folded. You can, in fact, imagine yourself folding that up into a small rectangle. So it was folded up basically eightfold. So that explains those marks, which of course are very distracting. And in many ways, because people don't think about these things, when they see the shroud, they normally think of these train tracks as being part of the image. They are not. They are an addition. Okay. So the shroud, I call it the Shroud of Chambéry, Turin, because those are the places where it has been stored. It wasn't always in Turin. And if we look at the shroud in detail, I'm going to focus here on the left side, which is the side with the frontal image of a man, and I'm going to blow it up so that you can get a bigger picture. Okay, just so if you like, I'm just giving you a little bit of an anatomy lesson here. You need to know these things before I can carry on with my discussion. I mean, for people who know the shroud well, this is old hat, but all of this is important. So on this piece of linen, we notice that there is a negative image, and I must keep stressing this. The image is negative. And if you don't know what I mean by that, unfortunately, we live in an age where people only have digital cameras, and very few people remember the old days when we were using colloidal silica and making photographs. If you take an image as you see it in the positive and you reverse the polarity, you get a negative image. And the image on the shroud is a negative image. It's not positive. Which means that the people who saw this way back in the 1350s, having not seen a photograph and not understanding photography, they would have seen this as merely a stain on the cloth. They would have seen it as a, if you like, sweat that had stained the surface of the cloth. And it just happened to be in the image of a man. They would not have appreciated some of the other characteristics of this image that we only know about today. Now, the scorch marks I've already explained, and they're clearly indicated here. And when it was being repaired in 1534 by the poor nuns of St. Clair, they are the female equivalent of the Franciscan order. In other words, they are women who have given up their rights to own property. They take a vow of celibacy and obedience to the church. And they lovingly took a year to sew in patches, which I'm indicating now, to try and disguise the horrible damage that was done to the cloth in the fire. And of course, in the process, they removed the image of the upper arms of the figure in the frontal image. You'll also notice a number of water stains. I've put circles around them. This is when the cloth was rescued burning from the silver casket back in 1532. A bucket of water apparently was thrown onto it to put the fire out. And the water mixed with, obviously, debris and dust in the cloth and made these watermarks. And as you can see, the watermarks are symmetrical, again, because the cloth had originally been folded up. And those watermarks are still visible on the cloth to this day. There's also blood on the cloth. Now, whether this is human blood or chicken blood or pig blood, based on more recent research, we're pretty confident that it is hemoglobin. But the point is, it was placed artistically, if you like, onto the surface of the cloth. And there are a number of key areas. There's what looks like an inverted number 3, and blood splashes on the head of the man. There is blood on the forearms and the wrists. There is blood on the feet, and there's blood coming out of the side of the man. And that blood I will talk about in more detail later. Okay, now if we go to the right side of the cloth and we blow that up, we can have a look at that in detail. And here we see a dorsal negative image of a man. You can just make out the back of his head and his back. You can see his buttocks, and you can see his feet, one of which seems to have made a bloody imprint on the cloth. That's how it's interpreted anyway. There are also very interesting holes in the cloth which mirror each other, and these holes seem to have been made at an earlier time than the fire of 1532, because we have a copy of the shroud done by Dürer, which clearly shows these holes in the cloth before it was damaged in the fire. Lots of speculation as to what they are, but again, the cloth must have been, in this case, folded into 4 parts, and somebody or something poked 4 holes through it. Whether that was a hot coal or whether somebody took a hot poker and stabbed it through, we do not know. But those holes are very, very recognizable. And we call them, the shroud people call them the hot poker marks. The bloody footprint, which I mentioned, also a very interesting trail of blood across the small of the back, which in medieval times was interpreted as a chain. They said that was the chain that tied Christ to the column when he was whipped. But it's not a chain, it's actually a trail of blood. The crown of thorns clearly marked on the back of the man's scalp. And that takes us now back to the complete image. So you have a fairly good idea of what's going on this cloth. Now, at the moment, this cloth is in Turin, and it is recognized by the Catholic Church as probably one of the most important relics of Christ. But that hasn't always been the case. Now, here's a picture of Pope Francis venerating the cloth. So let's just have a look at some critical background information that you need to have. And I must just say at this point that one of the problems with shroud research is that most people who have been involved in this have not looked at it correctly, in my opinion. They tend to look at it from the position that they are scientists and they are going to come with their knowledge of physics and chemistry, but they do not have an art historical background. To study the shroud, you need to have a very good general knowledge of theology, religious mores of the time, medieval society, things like hylomorphism. You need to know about alchemy. You need to know about art history. You need to know about a lot of things combined to really get a handle on what's going on here. And so this background information that I'm giving you is important. If you already know it, that's great. If you don't, I hope this will help. The first thing many people probably don't know is that in the early years of Christendom, the use of images became more and more important. Originally, for example, in the 2nd and 3rd century, in places like Rome, they were probably slightly frowned upon because of the belief that it was making a graven image of God. But eventually the church accepted that images were important. And in the East, in the Greek Orthodox world, images were very, very important. And starting in I'd say the 6th century and going up to the 9th century, there was a number of movements which tried to remove images from worship. Images were seen as being idolatrous. And so what is quite amusing here is that suddenly if you like, on the marketplace, images started to appear in the East, which were not made by artists. They were magical in appearance, and the Greek term for it is akaropoita, which means an image not made by a human hand. Now, these images are recorded in text, and we know that they appeared, and some famous examples of images would be the Mandelion of Edessa and the image of Camuliana. But the most famous image, which I'm sure most of you know, is the Veil of Veronica, which dates back possibly as far back as the 7th century, which is a piece of cloth which has the face of Christ on it. And the tradition in the Catholic Church is that when Christ was on his way to Calvary carrying his cross, his face covered in blood and sweat, Veronica rushed forward and wiped his face with a cloth and removed an image of his face. And that's very important because we're going to come back to that later. So there was an iconoclastic movement, the first one in the 8th century and the second one in the 9th century, where images were destroyed, burnt, and the akaropotoi, when they appeared, were used as evidence that God himself wanted images. Because if man had not made them, then surely they were made by divine hands. And if so, it meant that God approved of images. And it was the akaropita phenomenon which actually changed the opinion of the church. And this is a more recent image showing Christ having his face wiped by Veronica. And interesting, it's possible that Veronica, or also sometimes referred to as Veronica in the East, also makes the word vera icon, which means true image. So it's believed that possibly Veronica is a shall we say, an artificial name that was created around the aspect of a true image. So she's the saint who made the true image. So she's Veronica. The Mandelion is also related to this tradition. The Mandelion is a very big cloth which has an imprint of Christ's face on it. And in shroud circles, we refer to these cloths which contain images as sudarium, which basically just means cloth. Now, what is very interesting is that the image that was purported to be the Veronica veil, the veil of Veronica, has been in the church's possession for a very long time. And up until about, say 150 years ago, more or less, don't quote me on that, exhibitions of the face of Christ on the Veronica veil were common. And then they became less and less frequent. And certainly when the Shroud of Turin became an important relic of the church, the Veronica veil became less important. Now, the Veronica itself is still intact. It's right at the top of one of the piers that holds up St. Peter's Dome in Rome. And in this photograph, you can see one of the priests holding up the Veronica from the balcony right at the top of the pier, Those piers are massive. They're like the size of a 14-story building, each one. And the whole pier is dedicated to Veronica. And this is a very rare photograph of the priest actually holding it. Now, we have no images of the actual Veronica. This is about the best I can find. But we are fortunate that in the 17th century, somebody got permission to copy the Veronica, the Veil of Veronica. And he did such a good job that the bishop who gave permission said that he could not tell the difference between the two. So although this is a copy that I'm showing you now, it gives you a fair idea, I hope, of what the Veil of Veronica might look like. And if the original one is in fact genuine, it could date back as far as the 7th century. The question, of course, is now that we know about the Shroud of Turin, was this also a shroud-like image? And until we are given permission to actually see it firsthand, and the church, of course, will not give permission for that, claiming that the object is in a very bad state of repair. And even though in archives, it's normally accepted that images or artifacts in bad repair should be photographed for researchers, that offer has not been made for Veronica. So all we have to rely on is this copy from the 17th century, which is very frustrating. Just some supporting artwork from the period. This is 10th century image from St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai, showing King Abgar V of Edessa holding the mandelion in his hand. And these people believe that if you have the mandelion or the Veronica and you marched into battle, it would basically guarantee you success and victory. Relics being taken into battle was a very common theme at this time, especially during the later Crusades, for example. Here is a more recent 1420 image of Veronica holding the Sudarium. Now, a little bit of a side note, which is really very, very important. If we go to the 13th century, we're entering into a period where the crusading ideal is coming to an end. The Crusades started in around about 1080, and there were many crusades. And Louis IX, who is portrayed in literature as being a saintly man, and he's now referred to as Saint Louis, paid for many crusades. And he eventually realized, that traveling to the Holy Land to visit the sites of Christ's crucifixion and burial was becoming problematic. It was very, very difficult to keep fighting the Turks or the Seleucids or any of the Islamic peoples living in the East, because they were stronger. They were used to the environment and the climate. Europeans, especially, who went out to the Holy Land in these times, normally didn't last very long. They were not able to survive, and it was becoming very costly to keep the Crusades going. So he had an idea, and that is to allow people at home in France to have an imaginary pilgrimage, if you like, to the Holy Land. And I'm going to talk about that just now. And part of this was, let's get the relics of Christ here back into France. What's the point of going all the way to the Holy Land when we can bring them here? So in between 1242 and 1248, he built Sainte-Chapelle. Now, those of you who have very recently been watching the fire of Notre Dame may have noticed that very close by to Notre Dame, there is a small chapel, Sainte-Chapelle, a most beautiful building. It cost, for 6 years of building, 40,000 livres tournois. And its purpose was to house the crown of thorns, which were taken from the Emperor Baldwin II, who was Emperor of the Byzantine Empire. Baldwin had, in fact, pawned this relic, plus a number of other relics, which I'll discuss just now. And so Louis bought them from a pawnbroker, literally, in the Byzantine Empire. And he had to get a letter of approval from Baldwin to make sure that Baldwin wasn't going to claim them back afterwards. This is the crown of thorns that Louis IX brought to France, being venerated in modern times. And this is where the story gets very interesting, and maybe will give people an idea of just how important relics were in the Middle Ages. I just told you that the building cost 40,000 livres tournoise. The crown of thorns cost some 3.5 times more than the entire building. 135,000 livres tournoise. The crown of thorns is not even a crown of thorns. It's actually a thornless reed which grows in northern Britain or the Baltic region. So in other words, it's definitely a fake. But they paid all this money for it nonetheless because of their faith. A little bit later, a piece of the true cross and 7 relics of the Passion of Christ and a holy spear and the holy sponge were also collected in France. In total, including the crown of thorns, some 22 odd pieces of reliquary relics were included in this deal. And this should just give you an idea of the kind of stuff that was very, very popular in the Middle Ages. You've got the crown of thorns, of course, very important. A piece of the cross, that's a very popular relic. I think it was Desiderius Erasmus who said there are enough pieces of the true cross to create an armada of ships. The blood of Christ, which there are a couple of those relics still in existence today. They're normally they look a bit like test tube vials with dried blood in them. The nappies of the infant Jesus, blood from a picture of Christ, and also a sacred cloth inserted in a picture. Milk of the Virgin Mary, quite amusing. The actual reed that was used to hold the sponge of vinegar when Christ was on the cross. Moses' rod, a towel used to dry apostles' feet, etc., etc., etc. And on the right, I've just put in some images of typical relics of that period, not necessarily the same as the ones that Louis IX imported. So what you must understand is that relics was a multi-million-pound business in the Middle Ages. This is a photograph of Sainte-Chapelle, which, as I said, is very close to Notre Dame de Paris. And that entire building costs less than 1/3 of the cost for the relics. The building itself is technically a giant reliquary. And on the right, I've just put in a little picture of a reliquary to show you what they look like. They're normally very beautiful little boxes covered in precious stones, and inside there'll be a head or a hand or a foot of a saint. And while we're on this topic, it's very interesting in modern times that people use the word relic incorrectly, especially if you are keen on watching movies like archaeologists going into strange places, and they're always told that they're there looking for relics. They're not looking for relics, they're looking for artifacts. From an archaeological point of view, relics refers principally to the remains or some object associated with a dead saint. In other words, the head of John the Baptist, or a shirt that a saint might have worn. Sometimes it can be connected actually with a divinity, like the blood of Christ, for example, in a vial. And just to show you how amusing some of this gets from our perspective, a very famous relic from this period was the last breath of St. Joseph in a bottle. And you can just imagine how long that took to make and what it must have cost. Right. Now, Sainte-Chapelle, I'm emphasizing here the wealth. This is the peasants section of Sainte-Chapelle, the bottom section. Okay? Remember, this is collectively only 1/3 of their money spent. And that's another view. And then we go upstairs, spiral staircase, and we come to the upper floor. I'm standing on the bridge between the palace and the chapelle, which is Louis used to walk across this bridge to have his own private entrance. And when you go inside, this is where the nobles worshipped. And at the end there, right in the distance, is what's left of the altar that once held the crown of thorns. It was removed during the French Revolution, but this entire building is there for one purpose only, okay, to support and hold that relic. Okay, so here I've got a photograph of the relic as it appears today, encased in its reliquary, and on the left is the remains of the original altar. That's the ceiling of Sainte-Chapelle. It's a masterpiece of glass. And here we have an image of Christ carrying the cross to introduce the next important point that people must be aware of. I mentioned that Louis IX realized that the crusading ideal had died, and as from 1290 onwards, the church increasingly started what was called we call it today the Stations of the Cross, or the Way of the Cross. There are 14 stations, and what happens is you go into the church with your priest, and you stand in front of number 1, which is Christ being condemned to death, and you say prayers and you contemplate what happened, and then you move to part 2 where he receives his cross, and you keep on going through the process of him walking on the Via Dolorosa, which is basically the sad pathway on the way to Calvary. Now, if you go to the Holy Land, you can do this for real. But now you can do it in your own church. And to this day, this practice continues. So what are the ways of the cross? I'll just quickly put them up. I don't want to waste too much time here. But the 14 ways are: Jesus is condemned, Jesus receives his cross, Jesus falls the first time, Jesus meets his mother, Simon of Cyrene assists him to carry the cross, Jesus meets Veronica, that tradition comes in here, Jesus falls the second time, Jesus speaks to the women of Jerusalem, and Jesus falls the third time. Jesus is stripped naked, he's nailed, and he dies. And then he's taken down from the cross, which we call the deposition, and then he's laid to rest in his tomb. Now, the Shroud of Turin, as it is today, as an image, contains references to most of this. It's very obviously related to Jesus meets Veronica, because it is in fact a full-blown Veronica. It's not just the face, it's the entire body, front and back. It represents what happens after Jesus was taken down from the cross, and it also represents him being laid in the tomb. You could probably go further and say that it's also, for those who believe this, proof of the resurrection, because he's no longer in it. But it also refers to him receiving his cross, being stripped, nailed, and dying, because those features are on the cloth. The only features of the Way of the Cross that cannot be directly linked to the shroud are Jesus meeting his mother, Simon of Cyrene assisting him, and Jesus speaking to the women of Jerusalem. And this is a typical artifact from the period showing the Stations of the Cross. and other scenes from Jesus' life. Now, another issue that needs to be firmly grasped before we can study the Shroud of Turin properly is to understand the rise of humanism. Francis of Assisi, Saint Francis of Assisi, who lived in the late 12th, early 13th century, is a very important individual in terms of his influence on the church in the Middle Ages. If you consider the standard early Christian dogma about the relationship between humans and the Godhead, the Trinity of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Spirit were considered beyond our comprehension. They were considered high up and not available to us mere mortals. Okay? You then had Mary, who is the mother of God, who is the most exalted and most venerated saint. Her husband Joseph, who is considered to be the custodian or commander of the entire universe, the 12 disciples, the apostles, all the people who were martyred, all the sacred doctors of the church, the ones who came up with all the theologies and doctrines, all the people who died virgins, all the other saints, and lastly the priests, are all part of a communication system, if you like, whereby the people at the bottom, that's us, the man and the woman, can talk eventually to the Godhead at the top of this pyramid. This pyramid obviously reflects the social system as well, because the social system is also like this. You have a king or an emperor at the top. You have dukes and barons going down to landowners, and at the bottom you have peasants. So the social system and the religious system are in alignment. And at the bottom, man and woman really have no power. They cannot talk to, for example, the Father, the Son, or the Spirit directly. They have to go through a priest. The priest intercedes for them. The priest takes confession and forgives them of their sins on behalf of God. And the only people before 1250 who would even dare to talk directly to somebody like Jesus Christ would be a king, for example, a king or an emperor. Now, this is important because St. Francis of Assisi, shortly after the beginning of the 13th century, started to preach that Jesus was poor. The emphasis on Jesus being a human, the emphasis on Jesus being your friend, Jesus that you could share with, that you could be one with, and brought Jesus down to the human level. And this is an incredibly important movement within the church. The church were not happy initially with what Francis was doing, not so much because he was preaching a poor Christ, but because he was suggesting that the church should give up its belongings and its possessions and help to feed the poor. And as one bishop said to him, we have no problem, Francis, with the church, with Jesus being poor, but we do not want the church to be poor. And the result, of course, was that we have, with other factors, the beginning now of a movement in Europe, the rise of humanism, where the interest is now focused on humans as being the measure, where Jesus is portrayed more and more as somebody that you can deal with on a one-to-one basis. Now, if you quickly look at art from before the 13th century in churches, for example, this example in Italy of Christ Pantocrator, in other words, Christ as the omnipotent judge of the world and the universe, where we have something like a ton of gold used to depict his environment right up above the altar, in the this looks like part of a demi cupola that he's sitting in. Christ is beyond your reach. He is supreme. He looks down on you. And as you go into a typical Byzantine church, for example, you'll notice that the saints are smaller than Jesus. And as the saints come down the wall down to our level, they get smaller and smaller and smaller until they are at our level. So that pecking order from the priest up to the Godhead is represented in art in hierarchic proportions. So Jesus is always painted bigger. Virgin Mary would be painted bigger, for example, than other people to make her look more important. So when you start seeing some of the art of the end of this, what I would call the Italo-Byzantine period, you'll notice that the old art is two-dimensional, it's flat. This Jesus, for example, on the cross, has his eyes wide open because you were not allowed to show Jesus dead. Very important. You'll also notice that he has 4 nails, 1 in each hand and 1 in each foot. And he doesn't look like he's really suffering. He's just kind of standing around waiting for better times. You'll also notice that the blood on the wounds is very understated. In fact, images before this, they were not even the size of mosquito bites, all right? So now we see blood is becoming a little bit more important because they want the audience to empathize with what's happening. They want them to be part of this and associate with what's happening. And as humanism grows, now we're moving into the middle of the 13th century after the time of Francis of Assisi, and now we start seeing still relatively flat images, but the Christ is now writhing. He's twisting in pain. And there's a lot more blood coming out of the wounds. And in the sides, you can see John the Divine and Mary weeping, showing humanity, showing sympathy for what's happening. And if we move on quickly to a work by Cimabue, we see that now it's pretty much the same, the writhing Christ, but now the blood is really flowing, and we still have the weeping figures. And then when we get to the work of Duccio, we see now that the figure is hanging in a space, that he only has 3 nails now, not 4, because now they want to empathize the Trinity. So 3 nails is a better figure because there are 3 persons in God. And the blood is really flowing. In fact, the blood is flowing so much that it's spraying out of the side of his body and dripping down the cross. As we go into the 15th century, this need to emphasize the suffering of Christ and what he did for you as a human being is emphasized more and more. There's not only paintings, there's also play productions, poetry. It's a big deal now. Christ is held up as this pitiful creature, if you like, who did all these things for you. He suffered for you. So in this painting, you can see, which is done in the international style, you see that the nails are still in the wood, meaning that his hands were ripped off those nails to make you feel the pain. He very carefully holds the whip in his left hand with which he was scourged. An angel hands him a birch, which he might have been whipped by. He has a crown of thorns, and he is showing you the wound in his side, very, very artistically. This image, which is post the Shroud, belonged to the Duc de Berry, and the Duc de Berry owned the Shroud, which I will talk about a little bit later. And because he owned the Shroud, the artists who portrayed these images of Christ in this important book called Très riche de Duc de Berry, used the shroud as the model for the images of Christ. And you can see that this Christ here is bleeding profusely. Blood is dripping down his legs, down his forearms, and the blood from his side is really making a mess. And here's another scene from Les Très riches de Duc de Berry by Jean Collin. And it is obviously referring to the shroud. Of course, it wasn't called the Shroud of Turin at this time. It was probably the Shroud of Chambéry. And you can see clearly that Christ is lying on the cloth, and the wounds match those that we saw on the cloth. Another image from the Très riche de Duc de Berry, where the image of Christ as a man of sorrows who has risen from the grave is shown sporting the exact same wounds that are on the shroud. And just to really emphasize, these are typical images from the period, emphasizing the suffering of Christ and what he did for humanity. And so, look at poetry from us to the time, to the tree with nails 3, while fast I hang bound with a spear all through my side, to mine heart is made a wound. And this, now if you take this particular poem, it's almost a literal version of the Shroud of Turin, because it allows you to view the naked body of Christ and appreciate what he did. Right. Quickly talk about the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar get blamed for all sorts of things, and I'm very aware that it's a very popular theme to blame everything on them. But here we're in good territory because, or safe territory, because the first owner of the shroud was a nephew of one of the last Templars. So we need to talk about the Templars just quickly. I mentioned that the crusading movement was failing, and just quickly mention the Seventh Crusade led by Louis IX, St. Louis VIII. Then they lost the Knights, the Christians lost Acre, a fort, and that was really the end of the Crusades. And then Philip IV of France, who could see all these knights returning, realized he had a problem. He didn't want these people returning into French soil. A Knights Templar typically had not only a horse, he also had a soldier at arms, he had priests. He was the equivalent, if you like, of a modern tank at that time. And most of the Knights Templars were French nobles, and they owned land. And Philip IV realized that he could use the Knights Templars' land as a means of gaining wealth. And so he cooked up claims of blasphemy against the Templar movement, because now they'd lost the Crusades anyway, so he didn't need them. And from 1307 onwards, the Knights Templars were arrested all over France. He also asked the Knights Templars to be arrested in England, but there they got a better deal. They wasn't so much negativity towards them. So most of this happened in France. Most of the Knights Templars managed to escape because they were forewarned of this. And by 1312, the Knights Templars were abolished. I should also mention that the Knights Templars owed their allegiance to the Pope. And at one time, there were two popes, one in Rome and one in France at Avignon. And Philip IV kept Clement V, who was an anti-pope, prisoner, and made Clement dissolve the Knights Templar movement. And Philip IV is also known as the Fair. despite what he did. And here is an image showing Philip IV and condemned Knights Templars who refused to recant, being about to be burnt at the stake. In 1314, he took Jacques de Molay, who was the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, and Geoffroy de Charnay, who was the preceptor of Normandy, and he burnt them alive on the Ile de Juif, which is in the middle of the Seine River, where the Ile de la Cité is today. Before the Ile de la Cité was formed, it was made up of several islands, which were all joined together. And in these days, the Ile de Juif, which means the island of the Jews, was a small island owned by the Franciscan order. And the Franciscans objected to this burning of these two senior Knights Templars because they were trespassing. Right, so now we jump forward 50 years to King John II the Good, or in French, Jean le Bon. Now, this man decided to remake an order exactly like the Knights Templar, which is interesting because the Knights Templar had been disbanded by previous king. They had been outlawed. They had been accused of all sorts of terrible things like spitting on the cross. They had been imprisoned, that had their lands confiscated, and some had even been burnt at the stake. And now a French king arrives who decides that he'd like to revive the movement. And so he formed a group called the Order of the Star. It was founded on the veneration of the Virgin Mary. And just in case you're not too sure, he had them wear these giant star badges to show that they were members of the Order of the Star. So the king is the senior member, and then the barons and the nobles were created as part of this order. Now, the only difference between this and the Knights Templar is that the Order of the Star, they were allowed to be married and obviously own land, and they basically lived normal lives. Now, one of these knights was a man called Geoffroy de Charnay, and we call him Geoffroy de Charnay the First for a reason, because he had a son by the same name, and we call him Geoffroy de Charnay the Second. And you've probably noticed, if you're awake, that this is the same name as one of the Knights Templars who was burnt 50 years earlier. That Geoffroy de Charnay was the preceptor of Normandy, and this Geoffroy de Charnay was his nephew. And it's this Geoffroy de Charnay who owned the shroud for the first time. This is the first time in history that we know about the shroud. And that's terribly important. Okay. Now, Geoffroy de Charnay the First had held lands at a place called Liray. Liray is about an hour and a half's drive east of Troyes in France. And he built a wooden church there in which he started to exhibit the shroud for the first time in history. We know it started around about 1350. But by 1356, at the Battle of Poitiers, he was killed on the battlefield by the English. The English kidnapped or arrested John the Good and took him back to England and ransomed him for 3 million golden écus. Geoffroy de Charnay's wife, a woman called de Vergy, continued showing the shroud. And later, in the 1390s, a good 35 years after this, her son, Geoffroy de Charnay II, also was involved in the exhibitions of the shroud in Liray, in the little wooden church. This is a pilgrim badge, or what's left of a pilgrim badge, showing two priests holding up a length of cloth, and below it you can see the coat of arms of Geoffroy de Charnay II and de Vergy, his wife, underneath, Jean de Vergy. And you can clearly see in this piece of lead an attempt by the artist to depict what we now call the Shroud of Turin. You can see the man on the left looking at you, the frontal image, and then almost joined at the head, we see a dorsal image. And remember I spoke about that funny chain of blood across the back, which medieval people thought was a chain. Well, the artist here has depicted it as a chain running across the back of the man. And because of that chain, we're pretty sure and confident that this is an attempt to depict what we now call the Shroud of Turin. Recently, very recently, in 2012, they found a mold at a place called Masson, which is very close to Lirae. And unfortunately, it is damaged. But if you were to try to repair it and pull out a print, you can see that it is also very similar to the previous pilgrim badge. Now, a pilgrim badge is something that you would obviously pay money for. You'd go on a pilgrimage to the church to say that you had seen Jesus on the cloth, and then you'd pay money and you'd get a pilgrim badge so that you could tell your friends back home that you went on that pilgrimage. This pilgrimage was very popular. Remember, at this time, the church did not recognize the shroud as being important. Certain people, like the Archbishop of Troyes, got to hear about these exhibitions, and he was very upset because they were taking money away from his cathedral. Remember, in the Middle Ages, I told you relics was a multi-million-pound business. Churches needed relics because they attracted pilgrims. It's a bit like today with cinemas. The best movies attract more people. In those days, if you had the best relics, you got more people. More people means more money. This little church, this little wooden church in Lirae, was making more money than the cathedral situated in the capital or in the major city. So he wrote to the anti-pope, Clement VII, I think it was, and said, please, will you stop these fraudulent exhibitions? And because the anti-pope was related to the de Vergy, he refused. And that letter, that we now have a copy of that letter, which is in the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris, is a very important artifact because it tells us a lot about what was happening to this piece of cloth at the end of the 14th century. Right. Very quickly, the granddaughter of Geoffroy de Charnay, the first, sold the cloth to the Savoy family. And at that time, the Savoy family were based in Chambéry, which is very close to Switzerland. And in their Sainte-Chapelle, they housed the cloth. And this is where we start talking about gingerbread shrouds. And this is also really important to understand because considering the shroud was supposedly made at this time, it's rather interesting that nobody else managed to make a copy of it that was successful. So even armed with the original cloth, they were not able to copy it. And that tells us volumes about how it may have been made. The copies are paintings. They're crude and they're not very good. This one from Besançon shows a stick man with blobs for the stigmata. It's very crude. You'll notice, of course, there are no train tracks running through it because it hasn't been burnt yet. Then we have this really important copy made by Albrecht Dürer. Now, Albrecht Dürer was an incredibly talented artist. Those of you who do not believe me, go and look at some of Albrecht Dürer's artwork. He was incredibly talented. And even he could not make a copy of the shroud. That is really important. He came close, I'll give him that, but not close enough. Because for him, all he could see was this faint smudge. And we also see those hot poker marks going through the cloth. That tells us that they were there before the fire of 1532. We have another interesting phenomenon. If you take a piece of cloth and you stick it on top of the shroud, by magic, the cloth that goes on the shroud also becomes a relic. And so very often what they did is they made images on these pieces of cloth, what we call gingerbread shrouds, and then gave them to other churches to use because they were genuine relics, because they had touched the actual cloth that had touched the body of Christ. So it's like a sort of a medieval photostat machine, if I can be so glib. That is the recess in the wall at Chambéry where the shroud was kept in a silver box up until 1532 at the fire. You can still see fire damage. This is what the cloth may have looked like in 1531. And if you were to take a photograph, if you were to look at it today, you can see, of course, that it's disfigured with this burn marks from the fire. Here we have an image of the shroud after the fire and after the poor nuns of St. Clair have sewn in their patches. Okay, this particular image seems to have been made in 1608. And we have lots of pictures, as I showed you earlier, showing how the cloth possibly got the image of Christ. And this one, Jesus is laid on the cloth. And then we have this one by Girolamo della Rovere, who suggests that they made some kind of sandwich with Jesus as the meat, if you like, inside the 2 loaves of bread. And here's another depiction, possibly made by della Rovere. So in the sky, we have an angel holding the shroud after the fire. And on the ground, we have Jesus being carefully wrapped up like a human sandwich to make the image on the cloth. And here's another more detailed picture by della Rovere in an oil painting. Right, well, after the fire at Chambéry and the repair job, it was removed to Turin. So now it is the Shroud of Turin for the first time. It was moved to the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. And in the back of that, there is a chapel of the Holy Shroud. And the shroud was put into another massive box behind a grill very high up over the altar. And here you can see the shroud, you can see the box that holds the shroud. Very recently there was a fire and that box had to be smashed out, but that's another story. Now we come to the interesting part. Up until 1898, everybody had assumed that the shroud was a piece of cloth with a stain on it. As from the reign of Julius II, the Pope, who was responsible for commissioning Michelangelo to paint the Sistine ceiling, the shroud became an important relic of the Catholic Church. But it did not belong to the church. It belonged to the King of Italy, who was a member of the Savoy family, the family that bought the shroud from Geoffroy de Charnay's granddaughter, Margaret, back in the early 1400s. A photographer called Secondo Pio made a massive camera, and he was the first person to take photographs of the shroud in 1898, 2 years before fin de siècle, 2 years before the turn of the century. And these images are interesting. They're poor quality. Here we see the shroud over the altar in a frame being venerated. And here's a detail. But most interesting of all was that when he took this photograph of the shroud in the darkroom on the right, that's what he would have seen in the darkroom, because that's how cameras used to work. You used to take a negative first. You took a picture and you got a negative. That's the negative on the right. Now, how this used to work is that you took the negative into your darkroom and you re-photographed the negative to make it positive again. And while Secondo Pio was playing with his negative in the darkroom, okay, so there's the cloth as it appears in nature. And there is the negative that Secondo Pio took in his darkroom. And lo and behold, he sees something that nobody has seen before. He sees an image of a man, almost three-dimensional, far more detail than you can possibly imagine. And he was shocked when he saw this. He went to the church and he said a miracle has occurred. And the church accused him of forgery. They said that you forged this image. He took another image to prove that he had not lied. And the second image was exactly the same. To give you an idea of the detail, on the left you see an enhanced photograph of the image as it appears in nature, where it is already a negative. And the negative photograph on the right, where, lo and behold, the image is positive. It is so detailed that you can tell that the nose has been broken, the septum is swelling, the beard has been torn. It's highly detailed. And quite frankly, quite impossible to have been achieved by painting, because there's no ways that you can paint something in the negative polarity with a paintbrush. Right. When that happened, something like 4,500 scientific articles were produced trying to explain what was going on. This happened for about 5 years over the turn of the century. And then come forward a number of image formation theories. I'm not going to waste a lot of time on this, but just to give you the basics. One theory is that it was made by direct contact. That's what everybody believed at that time. And believe it or not, people still believe that today, even though it's quite impossible. Under that theory, the body is wrapped up like a sandwich, as I showed you in that painting by De La Rovera. And by some magical process, the sweat and blood on the body of Christ sticks onto the cloth, and you get a negative picture. Then we have a very interesting theory called partial contact. This is where the cloth kind of touches the body, but there are air pockets. And because of chemical reactions, and many examples in many theories here, for example, maybe they put some herbs on the body when they were burying it, and the vapors rose up and they permeated the cloth and it left a stain, and that is the image that we see. And then the last theory is that it's made by rubbing, frottage. Now, again, this was a very popular pastime. Now it's been banned. You went into a church, you went to a gravestone that had an etching or engraving on it, and you took a piece of paper and you rubbed it with a crayon, and you got a kind of an image of it. You can do it yourselves if you like. Take a coin, put it under a piece of paper and rub it with an HB pencil, and you'll see you'll get a picture of the coin by rubbing, frottage. So the theory was that somebody in the Middle Ages made a great big wooden or metal plate with the picture of Jesus on it, and then put a piece of cloth over it and rubbed it very hard with something to make the image. Okay. So let's just quickly look at some of these theories in detail. If we take a piece of cloth and wrap it around the head of a person, and in this image, I'm assuming you can see that there's a nose at the top because I've sliced through the head vertically. And if you pull the piece of cloth off of the person and then stretch it out to a flat plane, you will get a very blurred, distorted image. It's just not possible to make an image that's recognizable by applying a piece of cloth or paper, for that matter, onto a three-dimensional surface. Pretty obvious. Even though it's obvious, for some reason, most people are still trying to do exactly this. Go figure. These are experiments by Vignon, who was dealing with his theory of vaporography back in the early Edwardian period. And I don't think anybody can doubt that these images are very distorted. The person looks like a gorilla, the nose is spread across the cheeks. And if you take a photograph of them, the negatives, which are above, are completely unrecognizable. They look nothing like the shroud image. Another interesting thing is that the image looks a bit like a scorch. For example, if you leave your iron on a shirt, a white shirt, for too long and then take the iron off, you will have a perfect imprint of the bottom of your iron, including all the little holes. So perhaps you could make an image by heating up a metal sculpture and throwing a piece of cloth over it. So if we took this big gilt bronze effigy of Edward III of England, which also gives you a very good idea of the style of art at the same time the shroud first came into being. You can see the difference. This is very stylized and quite primitive compared to the image on the shroud. The image on the shroud is naturalistic, please note. But let's just assume that somebody had the ability to make a naturalistic image of Jesus like this and put a piece of cloth over it after they heated the sculpture. Well, the first problem is, of course, you can't make the image by direct contact, as we've just seen. And the second problem is the heat of this would probably set the piece of cloth on fire. So it's not very practical. So we can forget about Edward. Frottage. Well, frottage means that you have to rub, as you can see on the left here, that's a rubbing that's come off of a tombstone. Most frottages are two-dimensional. They didn't have the knowledge to try to represent a three-dimensional structure with all the shading in a two-dimensional form. It's just not possible. And if they used a three-dimensional tomb, like on the right, they would have had the same problems that we have when you try to take a contact impression off of a three-dimensional object. It doesn't work. Impossible. Frottage, another technique, the rubbing technique, which was tried. This was very popular in the 70s to try and prove that you could make something that looked like the shroud with rubbing. It looks nothing like the shroud. It's extremely crude. And if you take a photograph of it, it's really not very impressive. Just to rub it in a little bit, if you took Dürer's official reproduction of the Shroud of Chambéry as the best artistic attempt to do this, and there's a detail of the head, and you film it, and you make a negative, you do not get a positive image of Christ, proving that it cannot possibly have been made by painting, all right, or any artistic means. And so at this point, we are now basically at the point where we've tried every means to reproduce this. It's a mystery. It's a miracle. The church is now using this as evidence that this is the fifth gospel. that Jesus himself made it through some miraculous means. Right. This is kind of where I came into the picture. In 1978, the Shroud of Turin research project was formed. A number of scientists were asked to form this committee. The top people being Adler, Jackson, McCrone, and Pellicore. But you'll notice that all of these people are really involved in things like microscopy and physics and chemistry. There's no artist amongst them. There's no historian there. It's people who just assume they can come in with their equipment and they can somehow work out how this was done. The other problem was that they didn't do their homework. They came in assuming that this was a painting. That was a big mistake. If they'd actually sat down and thought about it just for a little while, they would have realized it's not a painting. You can consider pigment. I'm not saying don't consider pigment, but it's not a painting. The photograph tells you it's not a painting. It's far too intricate and detailed. They should have considered other possibilities as well before they wasted basically this valuable time. They only had a few hours to do this. I think I did it over 5 or 6 days. And Barry Schwartz at that time was a lecturer in photography. I think in California, I speak under correction. And he was made the official photographer for this event. So he took most of the photographs. And these are just some happy snaps, if you like, documentary photographs showing the scientists all working hard over that period. But there's another problem here, sorry to say, and that is that most of the people involved here, although if you read up on it, they will pointedly say the opposite of what I'm saying, but most of the people involved in this had a vested interest in their faith. Alan Adler, Max Frey, John Jackson, and Pellicore are all very religious people. They have put their faith in this object, and it determined their faith. The only senior member of this committee who was, shall we say, vociferously anti-faith was Walter McCrone. And he actually disagreed with much of the findings of the Stirp Committee, which is also interesting. But let's rush ahead and just look at some of the findings. One of the problems with this particular investigation was that because they were looking for paint and pigment, they didn't really, with their equipment, have the ability to look at anything of a high atomic number. They used X-ray fluorescence, but because they were using L-series fluorescent signals, they weren't able to, for example, test for silver, which, of course, would have helped me a lot because, as it turns out, silver might very well be the ingredient we need to look at more carefully. The highest element that they looked at, according to the reports that I've read from Stirp, suggests that only iron, calcium, and strontium were shown to be present on the cloth, and iron seems to have been the highest atomic number. The official conclusion of the Stirp Committee is very biased. It says that they can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. That's a real statement, that. They have no evidence for that. Okay. It is not the product of an artist. I agree. The bloodstains are composed of hemoglobin. I agree. And also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, according to them. And until further chemical studies are made, the problem remains unsolved. That was the official comment. Okay, closing note on Stirp. Back in these days, this is when people like well, when the Viking mission to Mars was ongoing, and they were taking the very first black and white photographs of the Martian surface. And people like Carl Sagan were involved with the Mars missions at that time. They had very primitive computers. These are the first, shall we say, modern computers, very, very old, 1978. I mean, this is really high tech for that time. They developed a system which could interpret dark and light surfaces as being deep or high. So if you're looking at a photograph of Mars in those days, these old black and white photographs, which are really clunky compared to what we have today, this computer analysis would allow them to imagine how deep the holes on Mars are, the craters, and how high the mountains are by the darks and the lights. It's a very hit and miss process. It's not very accurate. And this VP8 image analyzer was used on the Shroud, and it produced a slightly relief image of the man in the shroud. And of course, what's interesting here is that the train tracks from the burn look even more detailed and even deeper than the image of Christ, because they are really dark. So they read as being really high here. Now, because of this three-dimensional dimensionalization of the image using the VP8 image analyzer, people assumed that this was proof that the object that made the image was three-dimensional. As it turned out, they're quite correct, but where they're wrong is it wasn't a direct contact. And people are still trying to prove that it's direct contact to this day. They are wasting their time, as I will show you. Okay, now the most important part of my little talk, the image characteristics. These you have to know to understand what's going on. The clue to how the Shroud image was made is in these characteristics. And this is, for me, the most important outcome of the STURP investigation. And when I talk about the image, I'm only talking here about the negative image of Christ. I'm not talking about the blood at this stage. That's another issue. Okay, the first is it's negative. And when I say negative, I mean truly negative in polarity, to such a degree that if you reverse the polarity of that image so that negative becomes positive, so high lights become dark and dark become lights to the same degree, you produce an accurate image of a human being. And it is not possible for an artist, even knowing about photography, to paint something of that complexity in reverse. It's just not possible. This image is not just an approximation. It is highly detailed. As I told you, you can even see the swelling of the septum. You can see the beard being torn. You can see excoriations on the knees. Most importantly, there's no direction to the image. Now, directionality is an interesting feature. If you were trying to prove, for example, that you had a Da Vinci painting and you were trying to prove that Da Vinci had painted it, people who are experts in, say, analyzing the works of Leonardo da Vinci, they know how Leonardo applied his paint. And under a microscope, they can tell by the direction of the paint strokes which artist painted it. It's like a signature. Everybody has a signature. We all paint slightly differently. If you looked at one of my paintings and compared it to one of my students' paintings, it doesn't matter if the student was a better painter than me, and some of them are, my paint strokes under the microscope would look different. And if you have enough images of my work, you would eventually have some kind of stylistic analysis where you could recognize my work by the direction of the paint marks. The Shroud image has no directionality, which means that it was not made with a paintbrush. That is a major clue as to how it was made. Most amazing of all, there's no pigment, there's no dye, there's no powder, there's no stain on the shroud that's responsible for the image. I mean, there are stains on it, but they are water stains from when they put the fire out in 1532. But that negative sort of yellowy brown image on the cloth reads exactly the same as a scorch. It looks like damaged polymers in the linen, which I will talk about a little bit more later. The discoloration that forms that image is stronger on the upper fibers than on the lower fibers. Now, in some parts of the cloth, it does go all the way through, but if you want to see the image properly, you should only look at it from the one side. The image from the back view is not very clear and is patchy. And to sort of try to imagine this, imagine that in my model, the shroud is 5 fibers deep, okay, which is not true, but I'm just using it as an example. The top fiber will be very, very damaged. The second fiber will be slightly damaged. The third fiber will have hardly any damage on it until you get to the bottom, which will be completely clean. So the damage goes down layer by layer by layer, which means that the impact, if you like, of that damage comes from the outside and worked its way into the cloth. Also, each fiber that has been affected is only stained on the outside. If you break a fiber, it's white inside and discolored on the outside. Again, suggesting that whatever caused this came from outside. If you look at the image and you put it through a computer enhancement program, you can 3-dimensionalize the image. You cannot do that with a normal photograph. If you take a photograph, a snapshot, and you put it through a computer, it's not going to work, because normally in a photograph, you only have one light source from one angle. Okay? For some reason, the shroud image has this quality that is almost a relief. And that's another clue as to how it was made. The image is chemically stable. However, what the Stirp committee did not do is they did not pour bleach all over the cloth, and they would have got into trouble if they did. So I'm more likely to emphasize the heat resistance of this image. The image is definitely heat resistant. It was subjected to molten silver, which set it alight, and the image was not affected by that. The last image characteristic is my own. Nobody mentioned this in Stirp. If you look at the image in the photograph, in the negative that gives you the positive image of the man, there is no doubt that there is a top lit quality to the subject. In other words, as you look at his face, you can see that there's a shadow under his chin, there's a shadow under his lip, there's a shadow under his eyebrow. Okay, there's shadows under his fingers, and the shadows tend to be at the bottom, and the light bits tend to be at the top. It's very slight, but it's there, and that's also a clue. As regards the blood, despite all the nonsense that's been written about this, it is quite clear that the blood was put on with a paintbrush. It is artistic. It doesn't matter whether the blood comes from the feet, from the side, from the wrists, or flows down the length of the arm. It's all the same thickness. Magic blood. Anybody with half a brain cell can see that this is not natural. If this had been a real corpse taken off of a gibbet, bleeding for 6 hours, and then put into a cloth, however carefully, there would be an enormous mess in the cloth, not a neat and tidy little painting of the blood flows in the right place, and the blood on the side, and the blood trickled across the back of the body. It is so obviously painted, and yet for some reason people can't see it. If you look at the blood flows from the side, you'll see that there are rivulets that have been painted individually coming from the supposed wound. The blood from the foot on the left, it comes out of the foot in a zigzag motion, and there are lots of these zigzags all over the place. Zigzags on the arm, a zigzag out of the wound in the wrist, and zigzags on the blood across the back. That tells you very clearly this was made by a human being using some form of paintbrush. And yes, it might be blood. Blood's quite easy to get hold of. I don't doubt for a moment that that's real blood. But whether it's pig blood or cow blood or chicken blood or human blood, we know it's hemoglobin. Denatured met hemoglobin, as it is now. And they possibly put, thanks to Walter McCrone's work, which was highly objective, he suspects that there may be red ochre in the blood, and I think he's right, because if you leave blood for a few centuries, it normally doesn't retain its nice red coloring. The fact that this met hemoglobin, dried met hemoglobin blood, still has quite a strong red tinge to it suggests strongly that there's red ochre mixed with it. Now, obviously, blood already contains iron, so it's just basically a matter of enhancing the iron content with a little bit of red ochre, and the result is blood that stays more or less red. Very simple. Okay, I'm going to come back to the blood because there's another issue about the blood, which is very rarely mentioned, and that is that the blood has a halo effect. You will notice that in a lot of the places where there's blood, there's like a pale glowing area around the blood, which has given rise to the belief that the blood came first and the image afterwards. And as I will show you, that is completely wrong. Okay, clues to a solution. The shroud image behaves like a photographic negative. Okay. You cannot make a photographic negative by painting, and you can't make it by magic. And I'm ruling out miracles here because I don't believe in them. Photographs are caused by photographic-related technologies. Okay, photographic-related technologies. That means you can only make a photographic image if you have some chemical that is affected by light and changes its characteristics such that it may, and then be fixed, that it may then record what was projected onto it. There are many ways of doing that. You can use lenses, mirrors, whatever, but I'm not at this point saying what, but it has to be done with a photographic related technology. There's no other way to make a photograph except by using photography of some kind. And photography is a very loose term here. It includes any means of capturing light. Okay. The official date for the invention of photography is 1799. The people who made the first photographs used silver nitrate, this back in the 1720s, and they used to hide the image in a dark room, and you could only look at them with a candle, and if you took the image out into the sunlight, it went brown, because they didn't know how to fix. So fixing a photograph was a major step, and I speak under correction, but I think it was the 1820s when the first fixed photograph was produced. So if you know all this, and you know that the shroud is exhibiting photographic qualities, then the question for me is obvious. What photographic-related techniques or technologies were present in 1250 to 1350, which are the dates that I believe the shroud was made in? And I do that based on the artistic evidence, because artistically the shroud has to have been made after 1250. because it is part of the age of humanism, as I tried to explain so carefully. It's part of Louis IX's way of the cross. It is part of a Crusader period. It is an attempt to make a relic and an icon in one object. It is both Latin West and Greek-speaking East combined in one artifact. It's a very clever product. It could only have come from this time period. We know for a fact that it was around in 1351. It may have been around earlier, but it's doubtful it was around before 1250, because if it was, then the person who made it must have been a prophet who could see the future. And I don't believe in prophets, and I don't believe that people can see the future. So the problem is it possible for anybody to have made this in the Middle Ages? And of course, most people would just say no and walk away. But I realized that there's lots of evidence for something related to photography at this period. The camera obscura, for example, pinhole images, lenses, light-sensitive chemicals, and image fixing techniques. The last two are the problem here. You may remember this little maxim: when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Mr. Spock, okay? Okay, I hope you're having a little laugh now. Now let's go on to Holmes' maxim. It's an old maxim of mine that when you have excluded the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. That's where Spock got it from. Okay, so if you go back in time to the roughly 10th century, 9th, 10th century, in the Islamic world, we have people of the caliber of Al-Hatham, who wrote texts explaining how you could make an image inside a camera with a pinhole. And what he did was he put a candle outside a box, and then inside the box he observed that the candle was visible upside down. And below is a color picture showing you that principle. Al-Hatham was a very clever man. He also worked out that light travels in straight lines. He's the first person to do that. This is centuries before Newton. Before this time, everybody thought that light mingled. Al-Hatham put 3 candles in a row and then snuffed out the lights one by one to see what happened inside the camera. And he noticed that the opposite light went out every time he snuffed a candle out, proving that light travels in perfectly straight lines. He went further than this. He also worked out how binocular vision worked. He worked out why the moon appears large on the horizon. And he also worked out how rainbows were formed. Now, following Al-Hatham's example, if you have an object illuminated by light on the left, standing next to an aperture or a hole, say in the wall of a large room, inside the room you will get an inverted image of what was outside the room, but it will be made up of a series of holes, basically. So you have a blurred image. Okay, so we talk about the object conjugate distance and the image conjugate distance. This is a self-working phenomenon. You don't need any fancy tools to do this. If you put a lens in that hole and focus the light, then the image on the right becomes focused and is as sharp as the original object that was standing outside. Al-Hatham worked this out in the 10th and 11th centuries. Using the sun as an example, he used a triangular aperture and proved that the image of the sun that passes through the aperture is made up of a series of triangles. and hence it was blurred. So the only way we can do this is have lenses. And lenses go way back. They found lenses in Troy. They found lenses in Mycenae. I have a mold of a lens that was found in Iraq in 500 BCE, which looks like it came from a telescope. I have molds of lenses that were found in Tanis, dated to 150 CE. Both lenses are plano-convex, and if you put them together, you can actually project an image with them. They also found 46 lens-shaped crystal objects, which come from Byzantine period, and they were found in a Viking hoard. And here is an image of a lens that comes from Knossos, Crete, 1400 BCE. Here is a lens from Nimrud, Iraq, from the 8th century BCE. Here is one from Crete, from 650 BCE. 500 BCE from Greece, and the ones from Tanis, which I have copies of. We know that spectacles were first made in the 13th century. This is 70 years before the shroud was first discovered or known of. The lenses used for the very first spectacles, they come from places like Genoa and Pisa in Italy, and they're made out of crystal. And there's a reason why they're made out of crystal, because the glass that they produced wasn't good enough for optical qualities. It was green or yellow. You need crystal, optical quality crystal, naturally occurring rock crystal, to make a lens at this time. And if you bother to go and look at all the reliquaries that exist in Europe, especially in Italy, go to St. Mark's in Venice and go into the treasury and look at all the relics that are kept in rock crystal bottles. You will see amazing things there, massive pieces of crystal, huge pieces, all carefully shaped, some of them with lens fluting on the side so that you get a magnification of what was inside. There's an example of the quality. That's a solid piece of quartz that's been carved by hand from the 13th century. When I first wrote about my findings back in the 1980s, I sent a copy of one of my articles to Nature. Now, Nature is supposed to be the top journal in the world for new discoveries and new research. They refused to publish the article because the referee that they employed to check my work said that it was not possible for anybody in the Middle Ages to make a lens out of quartz. That all they were capable of doing was producing crude balls. So this photograph here is rather amusing in the light of that expert's opinion, because here we have a whole room filled with massive quartz bottles, some of them dating back to the 13th century. But according to the experts, they couldn't make a lens. It's very sad, isn't it, when you think about it? These lenses, which date back to the 11th and 12th century, were found in Sweden. They were not made by the Swedes or the Vikings. They are, in fact, objects that were stolen, probably, from the Byzantine world. Each one of these, wait for it, was lathe turned. Somebody turned these on a lathe in the 11th century. That's 300 years before the shroud was made. Perfect. And something else, we have to wait until the 1960s in our own culture before spherical lenses were being produced for optical purposes. Here are paintings of people at the exact same time the shroud was first heard of, wearing glasses or using magnifying glasses. Here is Nicholas of Rouen looking at a Bible through a lens. But according to the experts, they didn't know how to make these things. Here is Cardinal Ugo de Provenza in 1351 wearing spectacles. But according to the experts at Nature, couldn't be possible. Here is a surviving pair of spectacles from 1350. Light-sensitive chemicals on the next issue. Algebra, the father of algebra, knew how to make silver nitrate back in the 8th and 9th centuries. Albertus Magnus describes turning his hands dark by playing around with silver nitrate. And we know that they knew about silver sulfate. What we do not know, and this is very important, we have no written evidence that anybody knew why silver nitrate or silver sulfate were changing color. We have to wait for Boyd, much, much later, to explain that this is by light. In these early days, they probably thought it was weather or moisture. The Chinese were way ahead of the Europeans. They were making motion pictures as early as 180 CE. Here we have a zoetrope, which is basically a circle with figures on. Normally, in this case, it would have been dancing ponies or dragons. And then the light inside is looked at through a slit by the eye, and you can see the illusion of somebody running or walking. And it was exactly this that gave me the clue as to how the shroud was made. When I realized what the findings were from Stirp, and with my knowledge of medieval technology and optics, which is something that I study, I realized that the only way you're going to make an image of a man on a flat piece of cloth is to project the image with light. And that is actually photography. So here we have, on the left, we have a piece of cloth wrapped around the head, and you can see you make a blurry image, and on the right, you project the image onto the cloth, and you have an accurate image. So the hypothesis at this stage was that they took a man, suspended him in the sun, opposite a window with a lens in it, which had been boarded up. The light that reflected off of his body went through the lens onto a piece of cloth that had been soaked previously in a silver salt. And the result is that you get an inverted image. In the early 80s, I started my experiments, and with the help of an optometric expert at CSIR, I eventually realized that the only way I could make this image was by using crystal. I tried glass and it didn't work. And then one day I got hold of a lens made out of optical quartz. And in my early experiment, I put up this white plaster bust of a friend of mine by the name of Glenn Mayer. He's actually a very well-known photographer here in Port Elizabeth. And the camera was focused on this head. So the morning light would come up and shine on it, and then the light would pass over the head. At noon, the light would be fully in his face, and in the afternoon, the light would move to the other side of his face. I did this for 3 days. So the actual image inside the camera has the equivalent of 24 hours exposure. But remember, the light source is not static, it's moving. It's not like a modern photograph where you have a snapshot that's instant. This takes time. So when you open up the camera, this is what you see. You see a brown discoloration and the image inverted inside the camera, just like our thumb's pinhole images. And what we're looking at here, and this is really important, is a piece of cloth that was previously soaked in silver nitrate. It's been allowed to dry in a darkroom overnight. The radiation from the sun has taken the ions, because the silver in silver nitrate is an ion, okay? And by being exposed to light, it turns into an atom. And in that process of turning into an atom, it releases one electron. So the countless quadrillion atoms that are on this piece of, or ions that are on this piece of linen, have all released one electron each at some stage over a 24-hour period, depending on the intensity of the light that's hitting them. Now, if I take this piece of cloth and I dip it into ammonia, and you can also use urine, because urine is actually made from uric acid and ammonia. If you dip this into ammonia, the ammonia removes 99.9% of all the silver salt that hasn't been exposed, and it removes 99.9% of all the silver that's been reduced. That's the dark stuff that you see there. And so after dipping it in ammonia, this is what you get. Now all the silver has been removed. The silver ions have been removed and the silver atoms have been removed. There are probably traces of the atoms still in the cloth, but they will be literally parts per billion. So then you have to ask yourself, so what are we looking at here? That image is not made by silver. That image looks like a scorch. And what you're looking at is the linen itself, the polymers that make up the linen. In other words, the strands of molecules that make up the linen have been damaged. They've been broken down. Now, typically a length of linen polymer is about 2,000 molecules. We had this tested and we realized that they were broken down into lengths of 400 roughly. And when you break the polymer down into shorter lengths, it reflects a different light wave. And that's why you're getting a brown image. It's exactly the same as what happens when you scorch a shirt or a tablecloth. The heat breaks down the polymer in the linen. So this is actually a scorch. It's exactly the same as if you left your iron on, except it wasn't made by heat. It was made by light, by radiation from the sun reacting with silver salt. It is stable. You can take that piece of cloth out into the sun and it will not change. The image is on the top fibers. If you snap a fiber in half, it's white inside. The fibers go down in layers, strong on the top, weaker as you go into the cloth. The burning in, if I can use that term loosely, is stronger on those areas which have had the most sunlight. Over a 24-hour period, the nose, the forehead, the cheeks, the beard, and the top of the head received more light than the sides of the face and the shadows underneath. If you turn that around, turn it around, and then take a photograph of it, the negative shows a positive image of what was originally outside the camera, exactly like the Shroud of Turin. When I did this, I realized I was onto something. This is, very easy to do. You do not need to be an artist. And The recipe that I worked out after 2 years of trial and error with silver nitrate was 0.5% silver nitrate to H2O. So 99.5% H2O distilled and 0.5% silver nitrate. But I was not happy with the image. It wasn't quite the same color as the Shroud image. The Shroud is slightly warmer. Silver nitrate images tend to be a little bit more purpley, if I can say that. And I spoke to a very good friend of mine, a very famous chemist here in Port Elizabeth, Professor Peter Legh Allen. And I said, what other silver salt is there that's soluble? Because as far as I know, only silver nitrate is soluble in water. And he told me, what about silver sulfate? Because silver sulfate is slightly soluble in water. And would you believe it, that nature makes it 0.47% soluble in water? That is only 0.03% off my recipe that I worked out by trial and error with nitrate. So in other words, nature gives you the formula to make a shroud without any measuring equipment. You don't need any cups. You don't need any measuring. You simply take silver sulfate and throw it into water, and whatever doesn't dissolve, that's what you use, because it's slightly soluble. Which means that anybody in the Middle Ages could have done this without even having equipment. Here we have a very young Glenn Mayer who took a photograph of my next step. This is about 1992. We have a plaster of Paris corpse. And we hung it up. And by now I had a whole lot of silver quartz lenses made for the various purposes. The one on the right is the one I used for a full-length figure. That has a focal length of something like 4 meters, which means that the figure has to be 4 meters from the lens. And there you can see clearly the figure hanging up. And on the corner of the camera obscura is the lens. Inside the camera, okay, the camera has a lens, there's a gibbet, there's a corpse, and there's sunlight. That's what you need. If you go inside the camera, you can see the lens on the right in the corner. And there is the shroud stretched onto a frame. My safe lights are just candles, because candles can't affect the silver salt. So you need a shroud made out of, it can be made out of linen or cotton or a mixture, doesn't matter. Any ester will do, even paper will work. You need an easel of some kind to stretch it. And you need safe lights so that you can work in the dark. And that is what you see inside the camera, okay? So whatever's outside the camera, inside is upside down and focused. Right, so there we have, we pretend we're inside the camera and we're looking at my screen. We're standing basically next to the lens, looking into the camera at the image upside down on a piece of cloth that's been impregnated with silver sulfate. And on the right, that's what you get after 3 days. Then you turn the cloth around, you turn the figure around, hanging up, and you now expose the next section. So there's the corpse turned around, and inside the camera, there's the corpse upside down, 8 meters away, focused on the cloth. And that's what you get after 1 day, 2 days, and that's the front image. And that's it compared to the Shroud of Chambéry. I've taken away the train tracks on purpose so that you can have a better comparison, because obviously my shroud hasn't been in a fire. So the only difference between these two images really is the fact that my shroud doesn't have blood on it. The image is what I'm interested in at this stage. There are differences, of course. The one problem is I don't have the original corpse. The second problem is my lens is probably much better than what they had in the Middle Ages. There are distortions on the cloth, on the image on the cloth. The head is 10% too small for the body. I wonder how many of you have noticed that the head is too small. The front version of the shroud image is different in length to the back version of the image, which means that these exposures were done at different times. It might not even be the same body for the back and front. It might be that they used a real corpse and it started to disintegrate, it started to decay, and after 3 days they threw it away and used a fresh body. Anything is possible here. They may have mummified the body. They may have made a mold of the body. But given that corpses were pretty plentiful at that time, I'm quite sure that mummifying it would have probably been the easiest. I suspect very strongly that the head was made with a separate exposure, with a different lens, and then after they had captured the head, they then did the body without a head, and then the two basically fit together like that. That would have taken about 6 days to achieve that image. So you compare the two images, and just as a matter of detail, I put a cut on the chest of my figure to see if it would come out in the reversed polarity, and you can clearly see the cut under the nipple. That's how accurate it is. And this is another cloth that I made in 1993. Unfortunately, it no longer exists because it was not fixed properly. This was the Shroud of Port Elizabeth, a beautiful, beautiful shroud, which unfortunately no longer with us. The front body beautifully made and then joined at the head with the reverse. This is now in the state before fixing. What you're looking at here is mostly the silver atoms that are giving that discoloration. If this had been fixed, the image would be much paler and not visible unless you move about 2 meters away from it. These are some examples of the models that I use in my experiments. I use flesh-colored and white-colored models to play around with what happens inside the camera. Different lenses to see what effects I can get. One of the things I am trying to do at the moment is to ratiocinate the exact dimensions of the lens that was used back in roughly 1350. To do that is going to be quite a mission, because I have to work out the spherical aberrations on the lens. The figure on the Shroud of Turin looks rather feminine, which suggests that the hips are enlarged against the knees. That is possibly because of the lens distortion. The head, I'm sure you've noticed on the Shroud of Turin, the forehead is too short, which suggests that there's a distortion. The nose is very long, and the only reason why you don't notice a problem with the chin is because he's got a beard. This is another image that I made in 2002 using silver sulfate now, and you can see it's a much better color. And this one was made in 1 day, up close. Just 1 day to make this image. It's life size, and if you film it, that's the result. This is another test that I did in 2014 for CNN Science Channel. You can just see, if you look very carefully, there's a face starting to expose on that piece of cloth in an inverted position. That's the first day of exposure. And after 3 days, you get this. Okay, you can still see the silver atoms are those darker gray textures. You then remove it with ammonia, take a photograph of it, and you get this positive image. And that's what it looks like in black and white. And that's what it looks like compared to the shroud image. There are a lot of similarities, and there are obviously differences. The differences are explained, A, by the fact that my lens is perfect, B, the similarities are really interesting. You'll notice that I've got lines wiggling all over my image. Those are lines caused by no image appearing, because the cloth that I used had to be heated up and washed in a washing machine to remove starch. When people make material, they put starch into it, and starch resists the silver salt. Because the silver salt was not, the starch was not washed out properly, it has not allowed the silver in those particular places to reduce. And when the thing was dipped in ammonia, you simply end up with a blank piece of cloth. Okay? Now, similarly, you'll notice two black lines on either side of the head. That is a self-working phenomenon. That is because the sides of the head are always in shadow. So very little silver reduces in those areas. Interestingly enough, the shroud image has exactly the same issue, which strongly suggests this is how they did it. I don't know how anybody can doubt it. And it's been emphasized by the fact that the woof threads, now material is made on woofed and woof and weft threads. The woofed is put in first. They are strongly starched, okay, to make them stronger. And then the weft is put in sideways from left to right. I suspect that when they put the silver salt onto the shroud cloth before they exposed it, they hadn't got all the starch out of the woofed, and that is why the image is not so pronounced on either side of the face. It is quite obvious. You can see it. It's almost like a ruler, straight line, and it goes throughout the whole cloth. If you look at a photograph of the entire Shroud of Turin, that line runs through the entire image, proving what I am saying. One of the criticisms I get from people is, you cannot be right because you haven't made the same as the Shroud of Turin. And I say to them, you're not looking at this correctly. I'm trying to find a valid explanation for how somebody may have made it in the Middle Ages with the technology that I had. I'm trying to be objective here. People have accused me of being fanciful, that they're saying I'm trying to prove that they had fountain pens in the Middle Ages and all sorts of other nonsense. That is not what I'm doing. And to try to illustrate my problem, let us imagine that there was only one painting in the world, and it was the Mona Lisa. And here it is, the Mona Lisa in the Louvre. And people didn't know about painting. And let's say that to try to prove the technique, somebody painted the Laughing Cavalier to prove that it's possible to make an image using paint. Then the cynics will say, oh, well, it's not the same because the Mona Lisa doesn't have a moustache. And that is basically the problem that I have at the moment. So let me end there. Was that okay? Could you understand what was
Yes,
going on? Yeah.
I do, and
Yeah.
very convincing.